The Great Hall, or Banqueting Hall as it was known, at Edinburgh Castle, was restored to its former glory in the late 19th century, and it was here an event took place that has become legendary. On 23rd November 1440, the hall was the scene of what became known as the Black Dinner. James II was just 10 years old at the time. He'd become king at the age of 6 after his father, James I, had been assassinated in the early hours of 21st February 1437 at Perth. Following the murder, and with the new king being so young, Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas, the king's cousin, became Lieutenant General of Scotland and Regent. But following his death 2 years later, the Chancellor, Sir William Crichton, First Lord Crichton, and Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, the King's Chief Minister, took over, although neither were particularly experienced. More importantly, neither man was believed to be a threat to the Stuart throne. That said, the King's mother, Joan Beaufort, was a formidable woman who fiercely protected the young king. She too had been the target of the assassination in 1437, but had survived, due to being a woman. She remarried in the summer of 1439, and she and her husband, Sir James Stuart, the Black Knight of Lorne, were put under house arrest at Stirling Castle by Livingston, the then governor of the castle, in August that year. They were released when Joan agreed to place her son under Livingston's care. However, Crichton and Livingston were competitive to be in the king's favour, but they were also aware of the danger of one of the most powerful families in the country, the Douglases. The Douglases had risen to prominence during the time of Robert Bruce, or Robert I, and were seen as defenders of the borders. The wealth they had accumulated was vast, and their influence was seen as being equal to that of the king. The problem with them, as far as the Stuarts were concerned, was that they too had royal blood running through their veins. This caused Crichton and Livingston to view them with suspicion, and they regarded anything Regent Archibald Douglas had said, or did, as defiant. Relief came to them when the powerful Archibald died of plague at Restalrig near Edinburgh in June 1439, and his son, William, succeeded him as 6th Earl of Douglas. The new Earl was just 16 years old, but was no wilting violet. He was showing signs of being just as ruthless and dangerous as his late father. He moved around the country with a retinue of 1,000 men, it was said. He even had the audacity to send an envoy to Philippe VI, King of France, to arrange for his succession to the Dukedom of Touraine, a duchy owned by the Douglases. Normally, this was the preserve of the king, so it was a bit of a slight to James. His lifestyle was more lavish than the young king, and when asked to attend the Scottish Parliament, he declined the invitation, disobeying received protocol. Crichton and Livingston saw him as a threat to the king and decided there was only one course of action, and that was to stop the young Douglas from reaching manhood. He had to be killed. A plan was hatched and executed that November of 1440. A flattering letter was sent to Douglas, stating that due to a misunderstanding, the state had been deprived of his service, and he was invited to Edinburgh Castle to help in advising for the good of the realm. Douglas, flattered by the invitation, accepted immediately, flattered also how it made him sound important. Along with his younger and only brother, 12-year-old David, he set off for Edinburgh Castle along with a small entourage of loyal men. They stayed at Crichton Castle, just south of Edinburgh, for 2 days, where Crichton himself entertained them, affording them every honour and kindness, and when they left for Edinburgh, their spirits were high, and William was in a good mood. But the older men on his staff advised caution, urging him to leave David behind and not risk putting him in front of those they believed to be dangerous. William paid no heed to his advisers, and along with his brother, headed off to the castle. Along with Crichton and Livingston, they entered its grounds, but would never leave. Still under the impression that their arch-enemies were friendly, the two entered the castle. The young king greeted them, and they seemed to get on well together, as the king led them to the banqueting hall, where a grand feast had been spread out. The hall soon became filled with laughter, the Douglases relaxing and enjoying themselves. Then all hell broke loose. Legend has it, Crichton tore in to the young Earl, reminding him of the cruel deeds his family had carried out over the years, their lawlessness, and their disloyalty to the crown. While he was still speaking, carried up the hall to where William was sitting, was placed in front of him the head of a black bull. This was a symbol of death in those days. The young Douglas was startled, sprang to his feet, fully understanding its meaning. By this time, he realised all the kindness and friendliness he'd been shown had all been a ruse, and he was in fact encircled by enemies. He and his brother were seized and dragged from the hall. Meanwhile, James sat horrified at the unfolding events and began weeping sorely. He appealed to Crichton, but his appeal fell on deaf ears, so he tried Livingston, pleading for clemency for the boys. But again, his pleas were ignored. Crichton snapped at him, "Either they or you must die, for the Kingdom of Scotland cannot hold both a Stuart and a Douglas." A show trial followed, with the young king presiding over the proceedings, the Douglases facing charges of treason. There was no debating the outcome. The death sentence was passed on both boys, and they were dragged to the western court of the castle, where they were beheaded. The Black Dinner went down in history as one of the worst atrocities ever carried out in Scotland. However, it's wrapped up in myth and legend. An alternative scenario has been suggested, that the man actually behind the whole affair was James Douglas, 1st Earl of Avondale, the great-uncle of the boys. With them out of the way, it left him clear to become the next Earl and get his hands on the vast Douglas lands. If this was the case, it makes the chilling events of that night even more cruel, insofar as it was their direct relation who'd had them murdered. James the Gross, as Avondale was nicknamed due to him being grossly overweight, did end up as 7th Earl of Douglas, but only for a short time. He died at Abercorn Castle, his home in Linlithgowshire, on 10th March 1443. With the imprisonment of his mother, the murders of his cousins, and Livingston eventually allying himself with the Douglases, James' hatred of the powerful family who'd kept him in check until his adulthood would come into play during his reign. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.